Why was 1973 so important? I hope by the end of the talk you'll realise just how significant a period it was. Now, go to the next slide. As a young person, a teenager and that kind of stuff, I was enthusiastically trying to find out everything I could about the UFO subject. Of course, here in Australia, we got very exposed to stories from Tully about the UFO landing there in 1966. It's a picture of Horseshoe Lagoon, an aerial view, and the original story by George Pedley. Now, that's described as being as told by George Pedley. Now, I've been exposed to stories that have been as told by Bill Chalker, and I realise quite often it's a kind of an estimation or a vague correlation to the story they're actually told. And in that, he's referring to spaceships and stuff like that. And as George told me, when I finally got him to talk to me, he said that he never used the word spaceship, for example. He just referred to it as at best, like a flying saucer or whatever people were reporting. He didn't know what it was. So, next slide. During that early period in the 60s, I was exposed to obviously all the rest of the popular media, the visit of Dr. James McDonald in 1967. He was probably doing what I eventually did over the next 5 decades, and that was being a human vacuum cleaner and sucking up all the information about all the major cases in Australia when he visited during 1967. And if you ever get the opportunity to look at his files, do so. Amazing resource of information on that, and even on the Australian experience at that time. It's amazing the amount of information that he got together in that limited period of time that he was in Australia. The only thing I warn you about is you have a hard time reading McDonald's notes. He's got typical, almost MD type writer's script, that kind of thing, and you get a lot of eye strain reading his material. But Anne Druffel wrote a magnificent book based on his life called Firestorm, well worth reading. Next. Just a bit more media coverage in the day. Next. A lot of us feel some familiarity with this headline. We're not all crazy, that's the response that a lot of people in the civilian UFO community had with McDonald's visit during 1967. That he was an intelligent guy, well-credentialed, world-known physicist in the meteorological sort of area, a real expert on what was happening in the atmosphere, the ideal kind of person you would want to be looking at this subject from a scientific point of view. But next, this one is not a legitimate headline, but it cracked me up when I saw this in the Sean McAuliffe's Mad as Hell TV show a few years back. I love this headline. What might have been. Menzies, our Prime Minister back then in 1965, swearing fealty or allegiance to Gort. And it's a fabulous headline. And it says here, our new overlords encourage unfettered acquisition of material possessions to enrich our simple existence in a glorious scheme they have named consumerism. There are, however, some members of the community who irrationally insist that having a personal computer in every home will one day lead to public mind control. So it's a wonderful headline. And when you look at that headline in the context of the show, it's incredibly funny, it really is. Next. Now let's get back to the boring, serious stuff. So the 1969 is really like a prelude to what was to come in 1973. In 1969, the report that was sponsored by the United States Air Force was finally published. That's the copy of the hardbook cover. Here's the project coordinator and head director, Edward Condon, quite a world-famous nuclear physicist. And basically, that book became available, even in hardback form in Australia in early 1969, and they happened to have a copy in the Grafton Public Library. And I was on quite friendly terms with the library at the time, and I had the book out on permanent loan for 6 months, and they would ring me whenever they needed to get the book sort of back in so that somebody else could read it, but nobody did. So I was the sole reader of the Condon Committee report for 6 months at my leisure, and I must have read it about 6 times, literally cover to cover. And I got to say, I was astonished. And here am I, a kid, a young teenager, thinking about doing science, and here's science talking writ large that move along, folks. There's nothing really worthwhile. There's nothing of any scientific merit to the UFO subject. And in fact, any student that expresses an interest in UFOs perhaps should get demerit marks, because we should discourage them from studying irrational subjects and really stupid things. And I'm reading this, I'm thinking, what? This is, more than a third of its own data, their own cases that they examined, were left unexplained. And you're kind of thinking, did Condon actually read his own report? His conclusions were very conveniently presented at the front of the book, so most people only read the recommendations and his conclusions, his summary. So, but I think I'm not alone feeling this. Like, it drew me in, and as I said in that little piece. And by the way, what do people think of that interview? Yep. I've got one person saying great. It's, I think, an interesting thing. I feel as though I was being impaled by the bark from the Norfolk pine, and that's why I probably looked pretty distressed and uncomfortable throughout the whole interview. But it was. I think it just gives a quick overview. He probably only will end up using little fragments of the documentary, I would think. But as I say, there, 1969 was a prelude to 1973, played out in Oz, Australia, during 1969 and into 1970. Clearly, the UFOs had not read the Condon report. If they had, they would have realised that they were dead and buried, so gone for good, no worries. So next. Now, as an offshoot, right now, to give you an indication of how much things have changed, is that if you can get access to the journal here, Proceedings in Aerospace Science, Progress in Aerospace Science, their June issue, or came out in about June, is devoted to UAPs or UFOs. And one of the key articles is this article that's co-written by Jacques-Philippe Lougdini from France and Jeffrey Metchersky. And what they've done is they've taken one case from the Colorado University study that was described as unexplained or an unknown that they couldn't explain, and they went a lot further with the case. They actually found the actual location, and that's one of the things that the Condon Committee weren't able to do. Condon was almost obligated to take an interest in this case because the key witness was a fellow nuclear physicist, well credentialed, well known at the time. And so you had a physicist who was able to realise that here's this brilliant light source in the forest, its light source or beam or whatever it was coming from it was overwhelming the brightness of the high beam of his car, and from that he was able to provide reasonable estimates of the light intensity coming from this object, and was able to speculate about energy levels coming from the object. Now, the estimates seem to imply that the energy level was on a level close to a small nuclear reactor. Now, that kind of thing was astonishing, but it kind of fed through the Condon Committee report and virtually faded into oblivion. Meanwhile, people like Jacques Vallée and others managed to do a bit more field work, and they located where the event actually took place. And when they went into the location, they actually found evidence of burnt trees, tree limbs, that kind of stuff. They were able to take samples, and they kept those samples for a long time, trying to get interest from various government organisations, and ultimately it got to a point where they were able to get, particularly researchers in France, associated with Japan, the French official group, to actually study this burnt material and to do further work on it, and came up with some pretty amazing results. So if you can get hold of this, I really recommend that you have a look at this. It's pretty technical. What this paper? Yeah, June this year. Yeah, so if you go like I did, unfortunately, scientific knowledge is getting more and more monetised, and you literally have to pay a subscription to get access to a lot of this data. And given the fact that there's a huge number of scientific journals of interest out there, no one individual can afford to subscribe to a lot of these publications. So you'd kind of like to think that it'd be a bit more publicly accessible. Now, if you're a university student, you can go into the library like Macquarie or a university and get access free of charge to the direct journals, and even get a PDF copy. Now, if you're a member of the public and you're not affiliated with the university, that officially can't happen. But I managed to ingratiate myself into Macquarie University and said, hey guys, explained who I was and all the rest of it. And then they helpfully set me up at the computer, and I took a video of the entire journal. So, but I still had trouble. Like, students can go upstairs, get a USB stick, plug it into the computer and download the whole journal for free. But a member of the public can't do that unless they get that kind of access. So there are problems with access to scientific knowledge in many ways, but this particular journal issue is quite remarkable. There are other papers in there that summarise the level of scientific interest over the decades. There's a lot to recommend this particular issue of the journal. So if you have never read a scientific journal, just try and make an effort to read this one. It's worth your time. It just shows how much things have changed in the previous decades. Next. This guy has taken O3, which is a piece of AI software, to analyse the Vallée paper, and it divides it into three perspectives: the aspect, what's new, why it matters. Like, reopens a Condon era unidentified, revisits the 30th of December 1966 Haynesville, Louisiana ground level case number 10 in the 1969 Condon report, with the original atomic physicist witness Louis Galloway. Now, he's not named in the actual Condon Committee report, and nor is the location. Now, this is another unhelpful thing about the Condon Committee. There's no coherent identification of exact locations in a lot of the reports. You have to figure it out, and eventually a lot of people did. But why it matters, it converts a dusty blue book footnote into a forensic study anchored in a peer-reviewed aerospace journal, no longer fringe citation. And then what another aspect, high power estimate confirmed. Using modern thermal diffusion modelling on bark samples and IR photometry, the team reaffirms an instantaneous radiative output of 500 to 1400 megawatts, comparable to a small nuclear reactor. Now, that's heavy duty stuff. Very impressive data. Now, if it wasn't a UFO, you sure want to know, from a national security point of view, what was putting out that amount of energy on that spot. Now, it just seems remarkable that the Condon Committee could be aware of some of that detail and then just move on. you know, like, hello, you're kind of dealing with an event that has enormous, at least local consequence to the local environment. Anyway, lab work at CEA Scalais in France, bark burn samples analysed with ICP OES and gamma spectroscopy, trace nucleide ratios consistent with a short pulse radiation, not open flame. Bridges a 57-year data gap. The authors tracked, retrieved and retested samples preserved since the 1970s. Rare continuity across decades. Calls for an open sample retesting. Now, I've got samples of burnt bark from a lot of different cases. One, for example, from Coogee from 2008. At 3 o'clock in the morning, young bloke walking home after a shopping excursion into town, gets the last train out of Central, gets back to Coogee's, walking up the street to his house, and happens to see this big, huge sphere. Well, we'll talk about that as we get to it in this next, please. Right. Now, the problem with the Condon Committee report, and even though in 1969 I was really just beginning my actual research, field research in particular, during 1969, whatever UFOs were, or are, or UAPs in the current idiom, they put on a hell of a show in Australia in 1969. The US was largely isolated, so to speak, but there was a tremendous amount of activity going on in Australia in 1969, and it's what got me in. Next. These are just some of the cases. The April 1969 Bunga Walbin saucer nest, that's the case that really got me sucked into. You walk into it and you're thinking, well, if it wasn't meteorological, if it wasn't wind effects, it wasn't natural effect, what the hell was it? And you'd kind of think that hopefully there would have been a lot of serious kind of investigations from a lot of scientists of this case. Now, how many scientists got involved at the time? None. Nobody looked at it scientifically at the time. Me, I'm just looking at it wandering around in the field because my father happened to know the property owner who happened to be the local Member of Parliament, Ian Robertson. So I got an invitation to go down, wander through. Luckily, there was a local electronics technician by the name of Joe Tester who had an interest in UFOs. And he took Super 8 movie footage, and this is an indictment of early UFO groups perhaps, but he took that Super 8 footage, posted it off to the Sydney-based UFOic group, which I still coordinate the remnants of it, but I purposefully changed that group from a public group to a private group, still putting information out, a lot of information over the decades, but we just felt that, you know, we just wanted to research the UFO subject, and forgive me, but putting on public lectures, I really appreciate Marie and all the rest of putting on these public talks and that kind of stuff, but it takes a lot of effort. Marie can attest to that. There's a lot of effort that goes into it, and thank you for that. But if you just want to do research and communicate the results of that research, you can't do both things very effectively, I don't think. You've got to make a decision about what you want to concentrate on. And I wanted to do field research. So there are other things. Let's go through to the next slide. That's the Bunga Walbin case. That's Joe Tester on the right, Ian Robertson on the left. That little kid wandering amongst the succulent crop is not me. But I was a little bit bigger than that at the time. But next. What was not known was that on the north coast of New South Wales there were so many close encounter events going on, a lot of physical trace sites. This is my artistic rendition of a close encounter at where was it again? Harwood Island, a little location near a sugar mill area. Woman passing by at about twilight. Here's the sugarcane crop rotating violently as if some sort of tornado was going on. She looks across in the twilight darkness and sees what appears to be like the headlight of a car coming across the top of the crop. And she stood there and then the high beam was on her, and she felt as though she was actually lifting off the ground, and then the high beam goes off, and then suddenly she realises she's still on the ground, and she freaks out, obviously, and she sees this object, as you can see in the sketch. Hopefully my little bit of artistry there can give you an idea of what she saw. Now, it was a pretty close case. Like, the object was literally hovering above the top of the crop. And there seemed to be a lot of disturbance and a lot of damage. But did anybody go to that site afterwards? No. Nobody investigated. And I, unfortunately, only found out about years afterwards. And, you know, crop's an annual crop cycle. You're burning the crop off, you know. Who's worked in sugarcane farming? Nobody? I can assure you that it's a pretty onerous activity, and I've done harvesting. You know, you see the films of the Great Burning and all that kind of stuff. It's a bit more relaxed into other locations, but yeah, if you ever work up in far north Queensland in a sugarcane operation when you're burning stuff off, keep your money close to you on your person, because it was a bit of a cutthroat cycle. I did that actually back in, I think it was 71, between 71 and 72, during that Christmas vacation. A bunch of us guys decided we'd go on a surfing holiday up to far north Queensland, and great plans, bought a very cheap car, off we went. Car broke down north of Cairns, and we got stuck there, so for about 2 weeks we were working on sugarcane farms, that kind of stuff. Bit of a cutthroat activity, but we eventually got back. We actually split up at that point near Cairns. I decided I was going to go to Tully because I'd heard about it, read about it, and I wanted to find out what actually happened rather than rely on what people wrote about. And so by that stage, I was probably pretty suntanned by that stage, looking rough and ready, long-haired, surfer dude, that kind of stuff. Basically rough shoes, short surfing thing, backpack, that's about all I had. Hitchhiked my way to Tully, and then got a ride from a farmer to Arumo, where Horseshoe Lagoon was, where Albert Panisi's property was. And I don't know what Albert's system was, but he always knew when people were coming to the front of the property somehow. But I'm walking up to the gate, he's walking up to the gate. He happened to have a nice big, you know, the old machete tucked under his belt, looked a bit intimidating. He said, "Oh, how you doing, mate? What's up?" So I'm thinking, well, you know, and I explained why I was there. And rather than being told to piss off, basically, he said, "Come on in and have a cup of tea, you know. Stay the night if you want to do a night watch or whatever, I'll take you down." So that was my introduction to Tully and in person at Horseshoe Lagoon. And unfortunately, I wasn't there in classic research mode, weighed down by heavy duty equipment. I just had what I had on my back and walked in. But it was a really extraordinary experience just to be able to be there and wander about, except for when I dived into the lagoon, and one of his sons, I think it was Sean, who said, "You better watch out for taipans." He reckons I launched out of the water like a UFO. And he says, "Yeah, one of our dogs died last week." And I thought, "Oh, Christ. You know, could have told me about that before I went in." But anyway, that's local wildlife. While I was there, I never saw a single taipan. So, but I was looking pretty carefully after that comment. But anyway, it makes you think when you're wandering around at night time in the lagoon area, what's there. But then you realise they're pretty docile, and it's only if you accidentally tread on them, whatever, that they get a bit aggro, that kind of thing, most of the time, I'm told. But anyway. Okay, next. Yeah, another case from '69, Greenacre. Daylight, well, so literally a daylight, or twilight, actually. When was it? It was late evening, I think, but of a UFO hovering above a sports oval in Greenacre in suburban Sydney. Taxi driver witnesses it. He doesn't want to pick the fare. Now, any taxi driver that doesn't want to take his fare, there's something serious going on. He took off, didn't wait around to get paid, and the mother and her daughter were the key witnesses, and they saw what appeared to be three beings inside this object hovering above the park, and there was a sports team playing a football game in the actual sports field, but you know, as you know, with bright lights, they probably wouldn't have been able to see anything up there because the bright lights illuminating the park would have prevented them from seeing much. But they certainly witnessed it. But the level of ridicule this woman and the family got from one of the neighbours was outrageous. Like, she had the temerity to publicly report this sighting, but was vilified by one of her neighbours. You know, like, you know, that there must have been something seriously wrong with her to have reported a UFO sighting. You actually seen a UFO? Wow, you know, there's something wrong with you. But clearly not. Next. This is another attempted artistic rendition by me of a striking case from Childers in far north Queensland of a large object. Down came a tube, out came these very tall figures, roamed around, seemed to be taking samples, and then wandered back inside and left. Now you'd think, left behind apparently effects on the ground, the local media reported. Do you think there was a serious investigation of that case by anybody? No. All these lost opportunities all along the way. It's just crazy. Now, I visited Childers, tried to find out as much as I could, but this was decades later. Next. Now, here we come to what I regard as a really significant year, 1973. Now, 1973 had me wandering around at university. I'm studying chemistry and a few other scientific subjects, maths and all that kind of stuff, and physics, and people knew that I was sort of into UFOs and interested in reports. One Christmas vacation, I'm back in hometown Grafton, and as you do back in the day, on Saturday morning you'd be wandering, doing the circuit of the main street of Grafton, chatting to people, bumping into the people that you know, and I was wandering around with a chap, John Pitkin, who was he's very notable at the moment. He does a lot of wildlife photography, and his website's really brilliant in terms of photography, well worth visiting. Well, a letter had turned up in the Daily Examiner, the local paper, asking for UFO reports and stuff like that. And he said, "Was that you, Bill?" And I said, yep, definitely. And she said, "Well, funny you should ask that. Like, only last week we were seeing UFOs out the back of Grafton, and my dad, a few years earlier, had seen actually a UFO land near Woolgoolga, Emerald Beach, a few years earlier." And I thought, this sounds really fascinating. I thought, I've been looking for this kind of report on my doorstep for literally years, and here's a case just handed to me by somebody that I knew, who hadn't actually reported it to anybody. So I arranged for John and Ian, Carl, the father, who actually was the witness, to come around to my place. We talked about it at great length, and then we actually decided to drive to the location, because the key thing about this was that he saw it from three distinct directions. This is a photograph that was taken with the camera on, I think, on a stick, or we climbed up a small tree stump to try and get high elevation. Dead easy today with drones, but back in the day you had logistic problems trying to get shots like this, but it clearly shows that there was a mark there. But the beauty of this case, and it's similar to the Condon Committee case that's got the Scientific Journal study, the importance of physical traces, and even in that little documentary interview, I'm talking about the importance of being able to be certain that what you find on the ground does actually correlate with what was seen. Now, nature does all sorts of things, fungal effects and other physical effects that can create what looks like a UFO mark. Good heavens, you could even have somebody out there creating field art, like making a crop circle. It didn't exist back then, according to to this, but clearly there were isolated cases happening in England already and other places. But in this case, if we go to the next slide, this is the testimony. At about 12:45 a.m, he's driving between Coss Harbour and Woolgoolga on the way to Grafton. He's nearing the Emerald Beach area when he saw a bright light on the ocean side of the highway. He observed a circular object rise from behind timber some 500 yards from the road. It rose for a few seconds and then it hovered for about half a minute at an estimated altitude of 60 feet relative to the trees. The UFO appeared to be about 30 feet in diameter, and what appeared to be flames were noticed along the bottom of the object. The object then slowly returned to the ground. The object was partially obscured by timber while on the ground, but still had light rays going up at an angle from top and the sides. The object was still on the ground when fear of the unknown forced the truck driver to leave the area. Now, when I found out about this sighting in May 1973, and this took place back in 1970, it was with some reluctance that the original witness accompanied me back to the site. He wasn't keen to go back. But with his son, we went back to the site, and we had 3 clear-cut locations from the road to do lines of sight. A quarry area, a banana hut that was selling bananas, and the access road into the Emerald Beach area. And if you go to that area today, it's complete. You really appreciate that these areas change big time. Like it took me quite a while to orientate myself with all the roadworks and changes that had taken place. So through that triangulation, we were able to, and it took us hours to do this, sort of queuing out. We had walkie-talkies talking to each other and trying to figure out where the hell we were and going along the lines of sight and whether we were in the right place. And eventually we set it up and we found this nest arrangement, or this burnt area, and there was one major circle and another, and a couple of smaller ones, or a few smaller ones. Right. Only 8 minutes to go, folks, then you're free with me for half an hour. So, next. Hello? Next? Yep, it's all right. Yeah. Anyway, that's just another version of the same shot. I kind of felt in retrospect that Carl was really somewhat intimidated by the fact that we'd actually found something, because he was kind of hoping that maybe it was just imagination or something that he could just dismiss and walk away from. But John felt that his dad wasn't scared going back, but I just felt he was certainly ill at ease in that area. Anyway, now that site has been built on, and there's a Emerald Beach housing estate, directly on top of it. So, I did soil sampling and stuff like that. Took it back to the university. Used equipment. The head of the chemistry department came in on the weekend while I was working, and then he says, "Wow, Bill's doing all this incredible work, you know, and stuff like that." Didn't know what I was doing. He was just impressed that I was actually there, and I thought, Jesus hell, I hope he doesn't ask me what I'm doing. But the big problem I had with the samples was that back in the day there were tick gates operating, and in order to get through to Armidale, the bloody samples had to be sprayed by pesticides to get it up. And I said, "Come on, man!" I spent half an hour arguing with the tick gate operator, but in the end, I said, "Just give me samples of the pesticide, wrap it up in plastic. I don't want to be killed by exposure to pesticides, but so I had to run multiple scans to eliminate the pesticides and all the rest of it. And by the time the faculty head came through and saw me there, impressed that I was actually there on a weekend, because it's usually like a ghost zone there. Nobody works on weekends. Everybody is off party, that kind of stuff. But I wanted to get this done, but there were a lot of manipulation problems with a lot of dilution problems, and of course the pesticides didn't help and all the rest of it as well. But I did get some basic signals out of it through spectroscopy, but it was pretty basic. And my specialty, unfortunately, wasn't soil chemistry, but the UFO group of the day in Sydney, sort of Bill Moser, the secretary, said, "Yeah, talk to Dr. Keith Bigg of the radiophysics department at Ryde in Sydney. You know, he often assists us with samples." Anyway, I wrote to him expecting to get the big brush off, and he come back and he said, "Oh wow, this is great. One of the best stories I've heard, you know, about this. Yeah, so you're having trouble with your soil chemistry, are you?" And I said, and that's what I wrote about, and asking for his advice. He says, "Well, I don't know much about soil science either, so I'm a radiophysics guy." Anyway, he was very helpful and gave me referrals to various people and assisted in the long run, but ultimately there wasn't much that seemed to indicate a physical difference at the site. But he did leave me with parting advice, and this was exemplary of the times. If you want to get somebody interested in UFOs at that time, think of a scientific reason. You might as well tell them that you're researching witchcraft. You'll get a better response if you tell them that rather than that you're interested in UFOs. He himself apologised for that statement. He just sort of said, well, that is what it was like at the time. It still was. And possibly as a consequence of the Condon Committee report that officially said that there was nothing to the UFO subject. Here's a credentialed scientist saying, now, if he had the opportunity to do it, he would. But he said that privately, most of the people that worked in all these different departments were on a bit of a thread in the sense that if they sort of caused a bit of a commotion, brought in something that was controversial, they had problems. It could lead to some sort of tenure problem or whatever. So that's the reason why a lot of scientists, privately, they were really keen to help, but publicly, no, that would be the death knell of me in the department, that kind of thing. Anyway, next. From what we found on the site, it was strikingly confirmatory of what Carl had actually seen as he drove past, and it kind of explained what he saw. Like, there appeared to be this illumination behind the trees. Number two, he sees the object rising, it goes up and then it goes down, but it seems to shift. Oh, when he got to the quarry, further down the road, he's got this aerial view and you could see it down on the ground, and it actually rose up again, but then seemed to come down again. It seemed to move a bit and come down. And so it seemed clear that it decides, here's a good place to land. Oh, bugger, there's a few trees in the road, you know, knock them out of the way, whatever, and then manoeuvre around and find a good place to land. And that seemed to be what was apparent in the physical traces. So here was I looking for physical evidence of UFOs. Here's an event where the testimony of the witness led me to the site, and the details that we found on the site were consistent or gave an explanation for what he described from the road. He said that he had never gone back other than with us. Simply, it was clear to me that he seemed concerned about going back. And it may have been just simply for a psychological reason that if he finds that it's real, then he's got something to deal with. But if he just dismisses that as something he saw, he actually logged it in his logbook. You know, saw a UFO, delayed me by half an hour, and off he went. But there are other aspects to this case, but which we haven't explored. But unfortunately, Carl's passed away. But I had a nice interaction with Carl's son recently when I revisited this case. Next. Here we go. And so for the next decade or more, I was wandering around the countryside investigating hundreds of these sorts of cases. This is laying out a grid at a UFO landing case at Orange. Fortunately at that time I had on board Dr. Jeff Stevens, who was a metallurgist based at Lucas Heights at the Atomic Energy Laboratories there. So he went out with us and went out with my future wife, Anne, who was a child psychologist. The key witness was a child, and so that was an asset. And we go into Orange and we find out about all manner of other events around Orange and at Oberon. And I got to say, when we went to Oberon to investigate another UFO landing, illegal fishermen on a national parks lake there who were fishing, and they freak out, oh, we've been sprung by Parks and Wildlife, we're going to cop a heavy fine. There's this spotlight coming down, and then this spotlight, they observed it coming across the grass on the lake edge, and the grass was burning, and it went onto the water and it was heading towards them, and there was smoke coming up from the beam, and they're freaking out at this thing. What the hell is this? So they're doing their best to paddle away as fast as they could, and they didn't report it to anybody because they would have copped a heavy fine from national parks. But clearly it wasn't national parks. I don't think they're that punitive about illegal fishing. They're not going to incinerate fishermen and that kind of stuff, or burn the environment just to get rid of a couple of illegal fishermen. But I got to say, if you ever want to go somewhere that's freezing, absolutely freezing, go to that lake at Oberon. It is, the cold air just cut through you like a knife. It was one of the hardest investigations I'd done. Well, actually, it's probably been a lot more problematic, but next, I think that'll be it. So here we are, wandering around, still doing investigations, even as late as 2008, done some since then. This is the Coogee case. Now, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail, but we might just leave it at that, let you go for half an hour, and those that are willing and able, come back and enjoy the rest of the show. Here I was talking about some of the physical trace investigations I've done. A lot of that was inspired by what happened during 1973, particularly with the Emerald Beach case. That was, to me, a pivotal educational research type experience for me. And it really confirmed to me that, you know, with Tully and all the other cases, that whatever UFOs are about, there's something real and something physical about it. But that physical evidence is quite diverse. And that's where the problem becomes big time, because it's so difficult to deal with a lot of individual cases, not only because of resources, but this subject, ultimately, to do a decent investigation, needs what I refer to as a multidisciplinary, well-funded, open investigation using science, all the social sciences as well, and a whole bunch of other disciplines. It's a really wonderful appeal for folklore, for history, you know, any number of subjects, and that's starting to become very evident in recent years, you know. And I'm kind of they seconded me onto the advisory board of the Society of UAP Studies, based in the United States, and it's doing a lot of good, interesting work. But I keep telling them that, God, they're on American time. Every one of their meetings, it's like, you know, I'm half dead by the time I finish it. You know, at 3 o'clock in the morning. Oh, I'm a night animal anyway. But you know, if you want to talk to me on the phone, don't call me during the morning. You probably won't get an answer. I'm probably usually still asleep. So I tend to work best quiet at night time, you know, and when there's no interruptions except for bush turkeys, bandicoots, possums, you name it. We've got half of Sydney's wildlife in my backyard, I feel, so, but it keeps me awake. But anyway, let's go to the next slide. What?
We're going to describe about the Coogee.
I will later. Yeah, I'll get to it. Yeah, it's all right. He's trying to tell me how to do my talk, that's all. I'm taking your advice, but I'll get to it later. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll talk about it. Okay. Now, what I really wanted to talk about mainly are the series of things that happened during 1973 that make it so important, both in Australia and particularly the United States. Now, as luck would have it, or if I didn't want to do UFOs research for the next 5 decades, perhaps it's bad luck would have it, but this got me into the game. Here I am into a university degree. As I described earlier, when I had that daylight sighting over the university, and I'll come to that in a moment as well, very briefly, but I learnt on that day, on the same day, of a really bizarre event. And I'm referring to the possession incident. And that possession incident occurred in the early hours of the same day as my daylight, or twilight, sighting of a disc going over the Earl Page College. And that really, I really tried to investigate that very deeply to try and figure out what it was, and I just could not explain it. But the event, and I need to apologise for myself here, because I misunderstood what the guy told me about the event. I thought he was referring to a monkey in a shroud, but he was referring to a monk in a shroud. Now, you could probably say Bill chalk is very thick, but I thought, why do I want to investigate a story of an escaped monkey running around in a shroud? And I just ignored it for a while, and then eventually I made contact with him again, and I realised he's talking about an actual apparition. And I thought, oh, okay, let's go out there. So we went out there and investigated this, and my apologies to him for getting it wrong at the time. But I was still, even when I went out there, thinking I'm looking into a story about an escaped monkey and all this other weird stuff happening on this property. But then it became very weird when I started talking to the guys who witnessed this. Next. Now, here's the daylight sighting. This is my sketch taken on site, and I've drawn this in conjunction with the witnesses. And now even the detail of the tree going off at an angle, that's exactly how it was. That's what I call a forensic drawing, or trying to get it as exactly as it was. Now, this is happening just after midnight or in the early hours. Now, to get a perspective here, you're talking about a lot of students were living in the colleges like I was, and people just got sick of college life and they wanted to move out into the community, to move into a house in Armidale, or that became very difficult. There weren't many housing spaces available, so they'd move on to farming properties, lots of farming properties, but farmers were making a killing from putting students into barns, little shacks, all that kind of stuff. But people loved it, and what went on the farm, it was pretty private, but a lot of people, some strange things were going on. And this one here, I thought, was it drug related or something like that? But it wasn't. It was clear to me that here was a bunch of people trying to enjoy the country life and still go through and do a university degree. So they were nice people, and I marginally knew some of them from people from Grafton as well, and there were other people there living there as well. And it was one of the witnesses to this came up to me during the middle of the day prior to when I had this sighting over my college. So he's collaring me and telling me, as I heard it, yeah, we had a really weird experience there out at Mount Butler, yeah, monkey in a shroud, all that kind of stuff. Do you want to come out and investigate? And I said, oh yeah, right, yeah, whatever. Yeah, and just ignored it after a while. And then as it became clear to me later, I decided, yeah, this is something really interesting. I go out there, what they described, Phil, the fellow that talked to me about it originally, he's talking about, he's practiced, there was some disagreement about who was out there first, other minor details and stuff like that. But given the nature of the events that occurred, you can understand why there was difficulty, and also one of the primary problems was there was some silly investigator that didn't even understand what was going on and thought it was a monkey, all that kind of stuff. But so there was a delay. But the details were that he goes out, there's some disturbance amongst the horses they had there, and then he suddenly sees that, like basically a white apparition. It was seen to be shimmering with a black void for a face. Now, if you know ghost lore in England, the classic monk type apparition, but this seemed to resemble that. But he's calling out, guys, you better come out here. There's something interesting here, and he's screaming out. And the two other guys that was there that night come out, and they all see it. Go to the next one. Oh, that's a slide what AI does to my UFO sighting. You've seen my simple drawing. That's how it becomes with AI. So I wrote to the people who generated this drawing. I said, geez, nice painting, but I'm the guy who saw that, and it was nothing like that. You know, did you use AI? And he said, yeah, we did. You know, he said, yeah, by the way, your account's got so many errors, you need to correct it, you know, whatever. But I kept that painting as a, if we can eliminate AI problems that create this kind of thing, it'll be great. AI is a wonderful tool, I know, but in terms of written information and vacuuming the internet, if you're not careful about it, you get rubbish like this. But anyway, it wasn't quite like that. And it wasn't quite that intimidating or that big. I wished it was. Yeah, but anyway, next. There's a rough map taken at the time of the events. It's a bit hard to make it out, but today, if you go out to Mount Butler, it's a little outer urban development. There's a lot of housing there, a housing estate. And when I was last out there, I really couldn't figure out where the farm was. Well, I think there's a couple of properties sitting on it right now, so it's very hard to figure it out. But see, I had the map details. Even some of those roads have changed. They've done some sort of circular road that goes around Mount Butler, and the estate is on the hillside. Now, when it says a mountain, it's not really a mountain as such. I'd call it a very tall hill. That's about it. So nothing special. The only unusual things, apart from the location, country farm location, is here, and this is only about a couple of kilometres. It's called, at that time, the Ionosphere Research Station. What it was that it's basically a research station put up a whole series of poles with wires around them, and what they're trying to do, the university physics department, we're trying to bounce low frequency electromagnetic signals into the upper atmosphere. Then they get a bounce back effect, and they're looking for attenuation or differences, and it tells them a lot about the upper atmosphere, all that kind of stuff. Legitimate area of study. But folklore turned it into some sort of dark secret defence operation, and that it didn't help that a lot of people, locals that would drive past it, would experience car trouble. But the witness who described a UFO encounter to me there were a number of them. And one of them, I talk about this one here, March 1973, 5 objects in slow formation. That is there, he'd been working as a cleaner in town, and he'd come back fairly late after midnight, driving along, and he's answering the call of nature, as you do. You're standing there, dark, country nature, enjoying the night sky view, and then he sees this, what appeared to be 5 stars, move across there, then slip into a straight line and take off at high speed. And he thought, that wasn't stars, whatever. But anyway, that particular event allowed me to calibrate the fact that he had a whole bunch of other sightings that he had. He, more than any other person in that area, was reporting the most sightings to me. So I thought, this looks a bit hazardous, but it turns out that an obscure network newsletter that nobody would get, it was hard for even UFO investigators to get hold of, but a local person was creating a listing of all reports that were coming through to a few of the groups like UFOic, and one of these referred to an identical sighting on a precise date in early March 1973, 5 objects going into a line, but this was in Sydney. And so it might have suggested that it was some sort of astronomical event, but it sure didn't look like it. But it provided for me confirmation that he had actually described something that was reported pretty accurately by other people well away from his position. So it gave the other accounts more credibility that that maybe something was going on. So next. That's Mount Butler's today. That's that circular road around Mount Butler. It's called something else, I think, now. In Vagari, I think it is. Whatever, there's a little building estate. Yeah, how to spend big money and so you can live in comfort near the university. Right, whatever. But there's a lot of extra... Actually, that's in Gary further north. That's something else. They may still call it Mount Butler, but there's quite a few houses in there now. But again, unrecognisable. And the old farm is long gone. So, next. Now, this location, Mount Butler, was the site of all manner of weird UFOs, psychic, paranormal type events, that kind of thing. And at that time, well, I describe a few of them. Most of those were from the 1970s or 60s and that kind of thing. Here for Mount Butler, I'm mainly talking about the apparitions, but there were a lot of other things there at Mount Butler. Some pretty weird stuff going on. Next. Now, why did I introduce that again? There was probably a reason. But we've got the event. Next. My efforts at trying to draw it, a bit imaginative, but no, actually I'm not using imagination here. I was trying to draw what they were telling me, and I was getting them to confirm it as well. And that's why I can say that there's some forensic accuracy to these drawings anyway. I can never figure out why the fir tree grew at an oblique angle. It seemed to have a fairly stable root system, but a lot of tree life and a lot of things were weird on that location. Like, you'd come up to a tree, you'd look on the right-hand side of the tree trunk, everything looked natural. On the left-hand side, you'd look at it, and it looked as though it was stretched. And you're thinking, whoa, whoa. Then you'd move away, and that the effect had disappeared. You go back to that position, there it was again, and you're thinking, what the hell is doing that? You know, like it's... And then there were... By December of 72, the main kind of game afoot was that the students would sit out in the veranda and they'd watch where all the green lights would appear. And these were like little explosions of green light that a lot of people thought was swamp gas or something. And they'd try and spot where the next explosion of green light would turn up. And they're looking at all this, and then they're also looking at these shifts of what they could see that seemed to be specific to specific viewing points in the area, where the scenery would seem to shift and that kind of stuff. And you're kind of thinking, oh, well, by today's standards, it would have been turned very quickly into a portal, that kind of stuff. But I was trying to document that. I didn't see evidence of dimensional shifts or things like that. I actually saw very little on Mount Butler, but next year all hell broke loose at Turingham. You know, it was a really crazy time, but I'll get to that. So next slide. But that's the summary of some of the things that occurred, and it mainly took off mainly through this one witness. He was the main witness. Other people supported it through 73. January to March, there were sightings of what he referred to as golden balls of light that would buzz about all over the place. He reckons that the reason why he was seeing them more frequently than others was that he was out later. Virtually, in that community, it was like dead town, everybody asleep. There's no one on the roads at night after about 10 o'clock at night, except for somebody doing cleaning work in town driving back. It'd be very rare to encounter anybody in that area. Now, late March, you've got formations of light. That's the one I described. June, July in 73, there were what he referred to as green plasmic balls. These were balls of green luminescence that would float about and buzz about over the trees and dive into the forest near them and all that kind of stuff. And in October is what he referred to as the grand finale. And this was a real close encounter. You know, he thought all this stuff was harmless and he was having fun watching it, and that's why we don't have exact dates. He didn't pay too much attention to the dates. Tried to correlate it with his night work, but he couldn't give exact dates. And then, you know, I went around with him to every single location just to verify from his perspective what he was seeing. But the October event, this is important, the date, October, just keep that in mind when I start talking about Northwest Cape during October of 1973. There's a correlation there, maybe. But, you know, this is a story I've talked about before, but the correlation with Mount Butler, I really didn't quite figure out, but everybody's been talking about electromagnetic frequencies that you can signal the UFOs either by psionics or a particular whistle or bring down the UFOs. Now, I'm not going to make a commentary about all that psionic work type stuff, but it's been happening for literally decades everywhere. In the French communities, South America, even in Africa, even in Australia, that kind of method of bringing down UFOs or having a kind of directed contact, it's been occurring since the very birth of the flying saucer wave, and even earlier under different guises. So, so I'm not making a commentary about the success, efficiency of psionics or whatever, the latest buzzword. But this event on this road, if we go to, I'll mention that there was so-called space and time warps. And there was this really bizarre event, and I won't go into detail about the day, the afternoon when the mountain spoke. And it was kind of like a really weird, if you're out in the bush, you can hear this like a bush hum that develops like a bush noise and that kind of stuff. But this went way beyond that and went into almost like an auditory effect. And these guys was kind of, some of them were artists and a lot of them were doing arts degrees and stuff like this. So there was a real flair for flowery vocabulary. You know, they were invoking the bush spirits and all that kind of stuff. But at this point, when the mountain finally started to speak in their terms, it was issuing this auditory phenomena that got so severe that it started to hurt their ears. And they thought, this is not quite as nice as we were experiencing it. But, and they were hoping it was going to shut down. And it got to a point where they all ran down the hill, or the mountain, I call it the hill, but down the mountain, and then when they got to the bottom of the mountain, there was like a fallout of multiple meteors in the sky. And they're thinking, well, that's weird, and added to the few hundred other weird things that happened in that area. And then there's the events of car stops. Now, Greg, driving past that ionosphere research station, never experienced car trouble. There was others that were experiencing, local farmers, but who knows. And then there's the event I referred to, the demon skull photograph. We'll get to that briefly. Next. Here's the grand finale. He's coming back from cleaning. He's driving down the road, just had passed on his right the research station transmitters. That's Greg pointing to the intersection. I tried to make it as close to it as what it appeared, and all of a sudden he sees this object like he called it a coloured French loaf. That's what it was shaped like, with the segments of colour that you can see there. And it does this rotation effect, rotating about 3.5 times beginning at A on the right hand side, and then rotating towards what have we got there? To the witness, yeah. So it's rotating almost in the horizontal, then in the vertical, and then seems to, as if something kicks it, and it flies off at high speed in a 60-degree angle. And this is the closest that he came to it, apart from these other lights, and thought it was extraordinary. But he's there by himself, nobody else saw it. Now, I'll get to Northwest Cape. They're using ultra low frequency electromagnetic signals to communicate with nuclear submarines in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And that's what all the huge antenna array was. There's no direct correlation in the ionosphere research station was only using very low, well, nothing of the order of Northwest Cape. But was all the UFO activity due to that research station? Who knows? I talked to the people operating the station. What bloody UFOs, you know? Like, what? Yeah, they weren't interested. But there was an element of, don't creep us out with this stuff, you know. We've got enough problems keeping this project going. We've got limited funding. We wanted to do what it's meant to do. And so they were obsessed with getting that done. Northwest Cape dedicated to transmitting this frequency out. And part of the security is to keep people out because it is hazardous, that level of that frequency that's being put out. But people have started to speculate that somewhere in that spectrum of frequency, low frequency or to ultra low frequency, is the frequency at which so-called psionic operators are operating at. Who knows? But that's the close encounter. Next, the demon skull photograph. The guys are taking photographs. A lot of them they're experimenting with photographs, and they're cleaning a mirror. It's a bit hard to make out, and using flash and stuff like that, seeing what kind of effects occur, and they get this effect. I don't know whether you can see it, but it's like a skull-like face that appears like a human face in the smoke effect that you get. But you know, we're dealing with photographic effects these days every single day, but it was unusual for that era to have these kind of photographic anomalies. So it was interesting, but also Phil, because he was a bit obsessed with psychic phenomena, maybe he overblew it a bit, but he was telling me that he was seeing all sorts of apparitional experiences inside the farmhouse, apparitions of a skull-like face in his room, at the end of the bed when he'd go in and see one of the guy that was involved with the possession, he would see this skull-like apparition hovering over him. So he thought there was something really demonic and sinister going on, which sort of follows through. Next. We seem to have skipped that, haven't we? If we go back a couple of slides, and we'll get back next. Go back. Back. Yeah, one more. Yeah, we go back to this fella. They had the disturbance. He goes out. Phil sees it. We believe Phil was the first one out. The other two come out, and one of them, they're all disturbed by what they see. They couldn't believe what they were looking at. And it wasn't a monkey, it was this apparition or whatever. And I might get the sequence wrong here, but I should be reading it from a book, but it was like the apparition somehow seemed to flash like a flash gun effect and entered the body of one of the young men that was there. And he collapses immediately on the ground, and he's sort of incoherent, and he's having trouble breathing, and he looks terrified, but he can't function. And they look up, the apparition's still there, I think, but then they drag him inside because of the things that have been going on, and because this fellow's father had died 2 months earlier, they immediately think it's the spirit of his father trying to contact him. But they had this overlay of demonic possession and all that kind of stuff. They'd read a fair bit about all this. And they actually tried to do their own homebrewed version of exorcism and tried to get the spirit to go. This is how they're interpreting it. Then as they're hearing disturbances amongst the horses, they drag him outside again. He's still in a hell of a state. He's not very mobile. And then shortly thereafter, they see one of the horses, and this is the favourite of the guy that's possessed. The horse comes up, runs up, gallops up to him, rears up, and then the other two claim that they saw like a flash gun effect go from him into the horse, then straight out of the horse into the open air, and the apparition has disappeared. So that's the nature of the experience. Now, that was 1972. If we go forward back to where we were, keep going. Right. Oh, we'll stay there for now. I was going to include a reference to a year later in Pennsylvania. In 1973, there was this massive UFO wave and a wave of Bigfoot sightings. And there was, people linked the two, but there in Pennsylvania, if you read about this year, it's extraordinary. And there was one event that was studied in great detail by a psychiatrist by the name of Berthold Schwartz, and he studied it, and it involved multiple witnesses observing an object on the ground. The property owner and his son were there, and they see the UFO on the ground. There's two beings, or Bigfoots, they claim, that are hairy creatures of fairly large size, moving along the fence line within a few metres of this UFO on the ground. And the son is armed, and he fires over the head of he thought they were circling around to come at them, and he fires at them, and then he fires, he says, directly at the closest one, and he hears it scream out, or something of that nature. And then they flee at that point, as probably the average person would. And they call the police arrive, and the trooper, one police officer, goes with the son into where this site occurred. He thinks he can see an illuminated ground effect on the ground. But then they start hearing disturbances in the nearby forest, and there's something approaching. And they think they can see something coming close to them. Both the police officer and the son elect to hightail it out of there as quickly as they could. They then contacted the local UFO group, and they sent out about half a dozen investigators to investigate this. And there are other things that seem to go on, but they didn't see as much evidence as what these people saw. But there were multiple witnesses, police officer and the farmer and his son. And so it's a fairly impressive case. And certainly the psychiatrist, Berthold Schwartz, thought that they were honest people, that kind of stuff, compelling kind of witnesses. But as he would normally do he would do like a case study of the individual and see whether there's something in the case history of the people that might have contributed to this or might be relevant. And particularly the son, who had the possession experience. Oh, I didn't mention that, did I? Having shot at the so-called Bigfoot, there's apparently some episode where he collapses during all this, and it's like he's being possessed and turned into a wild animal on the ground, and people, he's kind of in a really disturbed state. So you're kind of thinking, I've had this alleged possession case in Mount Butler, just outside of university in '72. And a year later in Pennsylvania, there's this really weird case. And if you get to read Stan Gordon's book on what happened that year, it's gobsmacking. If any of it is true, it's amazing. It really is. The extent of Bigfoot cases and UFO stories. Now, if anybody's got something critical to say about it, I'd love to hear it. But to me, Stan Gordon's always been a fairly impressive investigator, and generally tends to get it as close to the facts as possible. And he was there that night at Uniontown in Pennsylvania, and he thought it was got to be the scariest night they ever had. And they were there in great numbers, and they were pretty freaked out by it, as everybody else was that night. Anyway, next. Here we are at good old Turingham, and this is what was going on in Turingham. Now, I just walked into this. Warwick Ford, the local electronics technician, hears about this strange dude on the campus at University of New England who's interested in UFOs. Yeah, I got something for you, mate. Yeah, there's some stuff happening here. Oh, this shit goes on every single night. It's been going on for a week. You want to come look at it? I said, hell yeah. He says, but I wasn't particularly ambulatory at that point. But he was going backwards and forwards, getting supplies from Sydney from time to time. So he picks me up on the way. Next time he goes through, and that's about a few days later. And so I find myself in Turingham for the weekend at this location. And I use the policy, I don't talk to anybody about what happened to me. I'm just a vacuum cleaner, trying to figure out what's going on. Just tell me what has happened. And these are all farmer type people. And there was a few people that were into communal living, but mostly farmer types. And Warwick, as a local electronics technician, he'd service Dorrigo as far as Lismore, down to Graf, wherever he got business. He'd be all over the place. But he lived on a property immediately behind the so-called corner store at Turingham. And basically, it was really only the store, the service station, cafe, whatever. But that was the main staging point for you'd come and sit down and watch the show or try and get it on video. Good luck with that. You know, it was a pretty difficult time to get video. But how are we going for time? Very good. Now, when we got there, I started bringing in people, equipment. You know, as I said on the video, I'm borrowing and stealing, and as long as you got it back by Monday, that's fine. Just borrow what equipment. You know, so I'm raiding the physics department and all other departments for gear. And occasionally a few of them would want to come and see what's going on, just mainly to protect their own equipment, I guess. But then they all wanted to leave fairly quickly for some reason, but they weren't hanging about. One of them did, which was a friend of mine, Greg Hardy, who was in the economics faculty, and he'd had a sighting of his own, which I've talked about before previously here, of what looks like a classic min-light close encounter. Really spectacular sighting. But he wanted to see it again. His sighting was at Texas on the Queensland, New South Wales border, a little be hard to call it a village, there's not much there, but it ain't like Texas, it's dead flat there, as the eye can see. But he has this close encounter, really close. And he heard his old school chum, Bill, is investigating UFOs on the Dorrigo Plateau. He says, I want in, I'm coming, you know, bring us up. You know, so off we go. Next. These are some of the sightings that others have seen. A little sister village just down the road, a couple of kilometres, a Darabin object with these rotating red windows around it and this tongue-like projection that would come out in and out of the bottom in green colour. That figures nicely in the case that occurred in, I'll talk about it a little later, in Ohio, one of the big cases that occurred in America during 1973, the Coyne helicopter case at Mansfield, Ohio. And out of that, a beam is projected that appears to cause the helicopter to go up in altitude while the pilot is trying to force it into a downward spiral to get away from a mid-air collision, and he thinks he's going into a dive, but the altimeter is showing him he's going straight up, and he's trying to force it to go down while he's in this green beam of light coming from the object. But you'll see that as we skip through it later. Here, the farmer owner and his brother coming out and seeing this red dome-shaped object just moving casually across the property, and it's a dome. And it just sits there in the forest, and he's talking to his brother, do we go over there? No bloody way. We're not going over there. So they reversed it back into the thing and went inside, looked at it, and then came back again to the window. It's gone. So they thought, no. This stuff was happening all the time. It was quite strange. Next, these are photographs that were taken. That's me and my old crapped out Falcon station wagon that was operating on a wing at a prayer. But for $200, what do you expect? So it was good value. Cockatoo Creek, which is just to the north of Turingham, a location of what I describe as like deja vu experiences that are related to this wave of sightings in the local area. Now they were Dorothy and John, I think. Their house was isolated, often surrounded by fog at night. They kept hearing this strange auditory phenomena like high frequency truck droning noise that would turn up over their property. They'd occasionally see lights in the fog and whatever. There was no confirmation that it was a mundane truck. It was something quite peculiar. They couldn't figure it out. But as I started to interview the couple, the wife, Dorothy, she started to describe various other experiences. And one that was really, out of the body experiences that she'd had, sightings of a ghost, a headless ghost, and that kind of stuff. And actually one of her out of the body experiences correlated with one of the few out of body experiences that I had, but I'll get into that detail at some other time. But it was, this one was off-earth kind of thing. It was really weird. But mine was mediated by the fallout aftermath of anaphylactic shock from taking penicillin that almost killed me. The locum that was giving me something to cure a sore throat. I'm thinking, why am I having this sore throat? Just when it's coming up the new year, I want to be out partying with everybody else and all that kind of stuff. And the locum gives me this medication, but he gave me such a high strength level of penicillin in it. The first tablet literally sent me into a huge rash all over my body within a couple of hours. And then I spent the next while trying to, this is Christmas time, try and get a doctor. You'd end up in emergency surgery. And I thought, keep having cold showers, because I'd done a lot of, attended some various medical safety kind of workshops about anaphylactic shock and all that kind of stuff. And so I kind of knew what the doctors would be doing. So my wife's freaking out and all that kind of stuff, but I'm there constantly having showers, trying to cool myself down. And luckily I didn't take a second tablet. They reckon if I had taken that second tablet, I wouldn't be here giving this lecture. So, so I wasn't impressed with the locum. And I said to my doctor, how dare you take your holidays at this time? You should have been there pulling me through this thing. Well, he wouldn't have given me penicillin. But anyway, I had a huge out of the body experience with that. But I'm not going to go into detail because it takes a while to describe it. But at Cockatoo Creek, the housewife Dorothy, before they had actually moved to Cockatoo Creek, they were a suburban couple. And they had decided they'd bought this property. Husband was going up regularly to build a house on the property. And he said to his wife, when it's all done and dusted, I'll call you down and you will come down with all the rest of the gear and move in. All sweet. Now she's having this recurring daylight daydream, she described it as, of seeing a vision of a window and like a country scene. But in the sky would be all these discs going over repeatedly in the sky. And she's thinking, what the hell, you know, it didn't resemble anything, any viewpoint that she knew in Sydney. And it was just recurring. She couldn't understand why she was having this. Anyway, finally moves down to Cockatoo Creek. She's in the kitchen for the first time, brand new kitchen, built by her husband and all the rest of it. And she's looking out the window, and there's the view that she saw months before in good old Sydney as a daydream type of experience. But what's different is it's exactly the same scene that she saw in the vision, but no things that she described them as like little silver missiles going across the sky all the time in this view out the window. Really weird. But here at Cockatoo Creek, seeing that exact view, there's no missiles or discs or UFOs in the vision or in the actual viewing out the window. But she's aware of what's happening down at Turingham. She says this must be related to what's going on here. The place, the whole valley is alive to UFOs, all that kind of stuff. And farmers are talking to each other. And that's the thing with these areas. They're often quite isolated and they don't talk to outsiders. But I'd been quickly integrated as an insider because Warwick had invited me in. He was widely known to everybody else. And if Warwick thought I was okay, I'm okay, you know? So they'd talk to me. And I'm getting stories from them all the time. And it was exhausting trying to keep up with it. But other groups came up as well and joined me there. Next. This is Greg Hardy's sighting. I told you about my economics friend, high school friend, who had seen the UFO at Texas on the Queensland border. He's doing night ploughing, best time of the day or evening to do it because it's cool, otherwise super hot. It was, I think, December of '72. And he's doing the night ploughing. He noticed all the sheep had congregated down at one end of the paddock, and he's aware of an auditory phenomenon, a sound of like a big truck coming in, and then it seems to stop. And then from that position appears a light that comes across the road at low level, literally at about this height, and it's travelling along, and he's thinking, oh, if it's a car or a truck or something with one light, it should be going up and down, like, because he knew what the road was like here, you know, all these ruts and everything, but there's no way. And he thought, well, maybe it's somebody with a lantern keeping it steady. But it was very steady, moved across the paddock. By this stage, he's right over on the far side of the paddock. All the sheep are up the other end. And he's then looking at this thing, and this thing comes right up to him, literally from the end of the table to him on the tractor. And he's looking at it, and it looks like this sphere of light with like a rib cage type thing made of light and a much brighter light inside. And he's looking at it thinking, well, this is a bit intense. I didn't come here for this. And then he's thinking, what's it going to do? And then it just seems to vanish from that point and reappear behind him, beyond the boundary fence, and just kept on its merry way, slowly going off into the distance, and it's dead flat there. Other farmers saw some light phenomena that same night, but not as close as what Greg described. That's why he wanted to come to Turingham with me to see all this stuff happening. Now we're going, yep. And with Greg, we'd gone up onto the property, like all of us were sitting more often than not on the seat outside the village store, or the one building in Turingham, and we're watching the lights at play, because by that stage you've got to keep this in mind that, you know, why weren't we there with huge amounts of equipment all racked up taking stuff? Well, we just got sick of trying after a while, you know, because we had all this gear. I was borrowing it, you know, pestering the physics department, the chemistry department for all this gear and dragging it up, and every time we set it up, these things would take off and we weren't able to capture them. You know, it was just playing a game with us all the time. And we felt, let's just watch it, you know, and just see what's going on. And we had multiple people looking at it and watching it. And they were doing all sorts of crazy things, zigzagging across the top of Boney Mountain, just directly opposite the store. One did a thing like this, stopped, came back like this, dropped down, then moved like that, and then dropped behind the mountain. And then the mountain started to glow. There was some glow effect coming up behind the mountain. We're thinking, that's got to be what went down in that same spot. And it kept going right up, and then we thought, it's just going to get to the point of showing us what it is as it comes to the mountain, and then it goes in reverse again. We thought, you buggers. And then same sort of thing over and over again, this kind of game. And we would be driving over these locations, compasses would go mad, and we couldn't get a decent directional fix on compasses, that kind of thing. And it was ongoing. And but that night, when Greg was there, we'd finished with the show over Boney Mountain, and then we start heading back up to Mollydale, where the property was, and behind, up in the ridge behind the shop, and we're starting to see lights and balls of light going down in the ravine, the remote ravine right up behind the property. We thought, oh, let's check it out. And Greg's saying, yeah, let's do it. Let's go, really on adrenaline. And we go up, and I'm thinking it's like a fire or something, but then I realised where it was right in the middle of the ravine. And I wasn't too comfortable about going up there in the dark because there was like a deep precipice that goes straight down. You'd kill yourself there in the middle of the night without proper illumination. So I said, let's check it out. It looks pretty weird. You know, like there was beams of light coming up, and the thing would move backwards and forwards. And we're thinking, well, it's not a fire. There's no evidence of burning there, and we're trying to figure it out. And so both of us start moving back towards the car to get the torches and all that sort of stuff to go up. Meanwhile, all the local wildlife, kangaroos, wallabies, you name it, and the bulls and the cows were all stampeding through the paddock. And we're trying to dodge all this local wildlife and the domestic animals. They seem to be in a big rush to get away from the location as well. And so we get back to the car, and I'm loading up the torches with fresh batteries, and then Greg's yelling out, look, and he yells out to me, and I said, what? And he says, listen, and you hear him, good thump, coming towards the car, and I'm thinking, that's a fucking big kangaroo. But, you know, I think that's what my exact words to Greg were. And I said, turn the car on, switch it around, and I managed to get the torch going and put it on the spot, the high beam on. But there was nothing there. It just seemed to come straight at us. I'm still outside, so I'm the main one going to be affected. And it just seemed to be like clump right beside me. And it was, we'd heard so much of the sounds of, you know, I'd been there for weeks and months, and got used to all the nighttime noises. You know, you listen specifically for that. And I thought, that's one of the strangest noises. The only other really strange noise that I actually didn't write up in my report, middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, this has got to be a bird, I think, but it sounded like the classic cackling of a witch in the middle of the night. And I'm hearing this and I'm thinking, I'm not hearing this. It's got to be a bird. It's got to be a bird. And it just got really intense, and I'm thinking, it's definitely a bird. But I couldn't pick up on any bird that this related to. So, but that was an outlier, an anomaly. But it sure as hell creeped me out big time when I heard it. I thought, yeah, that's probably done for the night. We'll head on in. But anyway, I'm doing a lot of this by myself as well, but sometimes Greg Warwick would come with me and others. But basically at this point, everything had changed for Greg. I didn't realise. He wanted out of there. He wanted to leave immediately, and I didn't quite pick it up on the level of concern that he had. He says, no, we've got to get home. We've got to be back at Armidale. He's literally screaming at me, saying, let's go. I said, well, I'm here for the weekend. I'm not, we're going back. You know, so into the car we get, off we go. And he freaks out when we see what appeared to be hitchhikers broken down in the car ahead. I didn't realise he was seeing it as something else entirely, like an object on the ground. And I thought, well, I'm not going to pick up anybody this late at night. And we're driving past them, and I'm slowing down. Greg's literally hammering me, saying, keep going, don't stop. You know, and he's thinking it's alien. And I'm just thinking it's some weird dudes that have broken down. And I'm driving past, and I get this look, and I'm thinking, they're seriously strange, you know. I'm not stopping. And kept driving. I thought, they're just looking at me, and I'm thinking, if you want to ride, you're going to be flagging me down, you know, and sort of making yourself friendly looking and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, and I'm thinking, no, not doing it. I'm thinking deliverance or something like that, or or something weird, creep out type thing. But meanwhile, Greg's thinking something else entirely. So anyway, we got back safely to Armidale, but I drive back. And I'm back by myself. Warwick knew I was coming back, and he said, if you're back after midnight, and it was already pretty late, sleep in the car. Because I'm not unlocking the house, because they generally didn't lock the house, but they started to lock the house pretty regularly because of all this weird shit. So I said, I'm cool, I'll be in the car. Anyway, and we're talking May, June or thereabouts. So pretty cold in the good old car, but I'd taken a blanket and everything. So anyway, let's keep going. We'll get through this narrative as quickly as we can in the next 20 minutes, and then my friend Horace will give you a talk. This is the craziest night for me. Warwick's wife, Sandra, has got a bit of the flu, and she's asleep and restless, and she says she woke up in the middle of the night, and she's having these visionary experiences, and she's seeing this. There's a water tank, tree line, and what she appeared to see like a transparent disc going across the tree line. Now, I'm outside actually investigating some stuff, and I'm almost in the same position as she sees in the vision. She is unaware that I'm outside. She's half dead to the world, trying to recover from flu. And I'm seeing here basically this light here, what I thought was a star or a planet, and it seemed to be shining a beam of light down through the trees. And I thought, that's pretty bloody bright. I looked behind me, and here's the whole building behind me lighting up as if it's been spotlighted. And I'm thinking, bloody hell, what is this? And then it seems to switch off, and then from that position, or thereabouts, up appears what appeared to be a much more high-level version of the daylight disc thing I saw a year earlier. And it passes over and then disappears about halfway. And I did think it was the Earth's shadow causing that effect. It just seemed to go out. And then but there were other things that happened that night. But next morning at the breakfast table, Warwick saying, tell Bill about your dream. Tell Bill about your dream. He doesn't want to know about my dream. On and on it goes and goes. And then she finally comes up with it, and she says, this is what I saw. And she describes that, and it was about the same time that I was actually out there. So I describe it like a shared vision somehow. And Sandra described herself as a psychic block of wood. That's how I describe myself sometimes. But, you know, I've had out of the body type stuff, and certainly I've seen a lot of UFO type stuff. So maybe I'm not that, well, maybe I am a little bit psychic, but who knows. But anyway, next. Other things going on in the region, the haunted Talawuji crossing, the railway crossing. The legend was, depending which way you went, you'd either see, I'm trying to imitate a ghost here, walking up the hill from the railway crossing. This is an abandoned railway crossing, by the way. And that's what people would see if they went across in one direction. And if you went in the other direction, you'd see this pop out of the rainforest. 4 squares of brilliant light, like a rectangular type thing coming out of the forest. Now, Dave Bushing and myself, was ex-SAS, he and I, he'd come all prepared, you know, like he'd have the full military gaiters on, you know. I said, yeah, you come prepared for leeches, Bill. And I said, but I've got nothing. Where's the spares, mate? But nothing like that. But anyway, so we're trying to cope with leeches and how many times did we cross backwards and forwards in all directions? Hundreds of times. Nothing happened. So after a while, we decided, well, we talked to a lot of locals that witnessed it, but most of those stories were stories that had happened maybe 6 months earlier, a year earlier, or 5 years ago, or whatever. But, you know, we went back to the location a few times, but never saw evidence, direct evidence, even though I was putting on a fine performance as a ghost there, walking up on the hill, but no recreating of the ghost, no ghost arrival, nothing. But it's a lovely area, it really is. Amazing area. Next. Here he is. Yeah, remember it's the 70s, guys. You know, it's sort of, yeah, we're in the zone. Next. That's myself talking to a local and Dave Bushing, listening to what was happening. This was a daylight sighting, actually, this guy saw. Next. Now, when the book Utah UFO Display came out in 1974, a year after we were experiencing all this at Turingham, I thought, hello, they've written the book on Turingham, except it's set in Utah. You know, and that was later the centre of all. This book was done by a biologist, Frank Salisbury, and he, it was a really good book. If you can get a hold of it, it's pretty rare, but it has been reprinted with a lot of extras, Utah UFO Display. In some parts, it was a bit of a reaction to Hunt for the Skinwalker, because Frank thought some of the stuff was not right. But he did say that the farming property involved was right at ground zero in Utah, but he said that UFO reports were coming in from all over the Unitah Basin in Utah. So it was pretty interesting. That trilogy of books are well worth reading if you want to get a bit of calibration. But along comes Bigelow, buys the property, sets up NIDS and monitoring of the Skinwalker Ranch. Everything goes dark. The only data that you... Actually, Horace, if you're still here, you around here, Horace? You got a bit of a briefing from Bigelow, didn't you? Yeah, good. You should talk about it before you talk about the event. Okay. Yeah, but anyway, Bigelow wasn't big on sharing data. It was always one-way flow of information. And it was like when Cole Kellner contacted me wanting all my Chinese sources with all the trips I'd made into China. Yeah, and I said, sure, I'll share them on a reciprocal basis. Whatever you get out of it, you share with me. That kind of thing. Oh, no, it's not the way it operates. It's one-way flow. You don't get the information back. I thought, well, bugger you. I'm not going to share it. You know, most of my sources were public anyway. So because I was sharing information all over the place. But so it wouldn't have been too hard for the resources that he had to replicate some of the people I'd been talking to for about 5 years or thereabouts. 3 visits, 2001, 2005, 2006. But again, this was like deja vu. It was almost like a carbon copy of a lot of the weirdness going on in Turingham and the Dorrigo Plateau. Next. Then you've got the recent Cropper Brooks Skinwalker at the Pentagon by Lukatsky, who was the DIA guy that was running the project, along with Cole Kellner and my old mate George Knapp. He's good value. George shared what he could share, but he was being rather tied off by Bigelow would only allow him to share certain amounts of information. And but over the decades, I think George has put out a fair bit of information. So those 2 books are very worthwhile reading. For me, it's reading between the lines, you know, what's not said in some cases. Now, below George and me, this is a photo of us in Sydney in 2007, but below that we got Jay Stratton, who was the head of the UAP project, and he's the guy identified as Axelrod in this book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. Axelrod and two other commando types from the DIA are doing a bit of a walk around the Skinwalker Ranch. First evening they were there, they weren't expecting anything to happen. They experienced this kind of presence. They got the infrared gear. We didn't have infrared gear, but they were becoming aware of a presence approaching them, and they're thinking about, these are hardened commando types. Admittedly, with my experience in Turingham, Dave was a ex-commando SAS, and so he was a pretty hard-nosed guy, knew no fear more or less, and I thought I was pretty not easily scared either. But then here's Jay Stratton with these two commanders, and suddenly they're overwhelmed by an overwhelming sense of fear, and it was almost debilitating. And they retreat, and they thought, well, shit, that's first evening's events. We're here for a while. You know, that was overwhelming. It was quite frightening. But with my own experience with Dave, this was back in about August '73, where we're investigating various sightings. It had pretty much quietened down, we thought, over the whole valley. We're getting pockets of sightings here and there, and we're investigating one sighting. And because I knew some of the farmers, they didn't mind a late night call. If they were still awake, they'd answer it. And I'm saying, I rang the farmer who we thought there was something had come down on his property. Have you got something in your back paddock with lights on? No, Bill. No, we're going to bed. We don't want to know about it. You can come onto the property. Don't worry about it. You know, and we go over the ridge line. We're walking up the ridge actually, and we're hit with this really intense sense of fear. And I was thinking, it's just me? And I look at Dave, and Dave's looking at me, and I said, what are you feeling, Dave? I said, I want to get the fuck out of here. That's what his words were. And I said, why? He says, there's something bad here. Let's go down the hill again. So we go back down the hill again, and then that feeling passed. And we go back up over the hill, nothing there. And no reoccurrence of this fear experience. It was really very direct. So when I heard Jay Stratton describe the experience as Axelrod on the property the first night there at Skinwalker, I thought, not another piece of deja vu there. Like exactly the kind of stuff that was happening at Turingham, but they were doing this much later. Next. And we've got probably 10 minutes to scream through 1,000 slides. No, not quite 1,000. But what's happening meanwhile, October 7, that photograph's taken on October 7, 1973. What's happening across the big pond in the US? Check it out. Next slide. Hynek, Dr. Alan Hynek, the originator of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that term, all the rest of it, Close Encounter Man, author of the UFO Experience. If you haven't read the UFO Experience, you should read that, just to educate yourselves. But while Hynek was in Australia, he had a meeting at the Directorate of Air Force Intelligence's headquarters in Canberra. Hynek was present. The nuclear scientist that I eventually found through the Air Force files and met with him in his retirement, Harry Turner, was there, and also another, originally a CSIRO scientist, but later the Bureau of Standards and stuff like that. And turns out Mike Duggan, he went on to DARPA at Kirtland Air Force Base, and that's another story in itself, what went on at Kirtland. But so there's the three of them. That's me meeting Hynek in '84, Harry Turner and myself meeting at his place of retirement, and Mike Duggan with his, I guess, stock photo. Duggan was very hard to find in his DARPA days, but we did correspond. But next, they were talking about the scientific benefit of with Daffy to do a scientific investigation rather than a military intelligence investigation. Yeah, and they said, nodding their heads, yes, of course, we'll do that. No scientific investigation with the RAAF, literally. You know, there's an article I did for, was it New Dawn, Harry Turner and the Secret UFO Science Wars of Oz. I gave a previous lecture here on Harry Turner, and found Harry in the RAAF files. That's me at the RAAF desk. And there's Harry in the video interview we did with him, which was fortunate we managed to get that out of him. Next. So, in the United States, they were being invaded by UFOs and aliens. Literally in '73, it was the biggest wave of sightings that the United States had ever had. The only thing that came remotely close to it was the 1952 wave. It was the famous Washington DC sightings. And these are headlines from Australian papers. The big American comeback of creatures from outer space. Next, that headline, America gripped by the great UFO boom. Literally hundreds of sightings. And some of them were extraordinary. I'm only going to talk about a couple because they're really special. Next, Pascagoula. Now, Pascagoula, when I first heard about that, it was amazing. And I was getting some information indirectly from Heineck and others, and they were staggered by it. They were very impressed by Charlie Hickson, Calvin Parker. But I think the publicity as it was dampened the enthusiasm of people coming out into the open. Like, more broadly, Charlie Hickson was the main guy talking, and he was just having to put up with so much crap all the time. You know, literally almost destroyed his private life and all that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, Calvin, the younger bloke, who had only just started day one of his job at the local factory, a job that Charlie Hickson had got. So on their first day, he said, "There, you've done your first day. Why don't we go fishing?" So they go fishing, and all hell breaks loose, you know. And the Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker's experience at Pascagoula broke out, and it got worldwide publicity. Now, nothing like today's publicity. Literally, print media and TV and all the rest of it were reporting this worldwide. A huge story, and there was so much coverage here too. Next. Look, next again, here's some of the thing. Same time as Uri Geller bending spoons and forks across England and America and Australia. Fisherman, terrifying experience. Next, a book came out the next year. Really worthwhile getting this if you want to read a sort of a contemporary account of how the thing played out. Ralph Blum was there on the day and the evening that Charlie and Calvin went to Keesler Air Force Base, also to police headquarters and also to the Naval Shipyard where they worked, and was able to get a lot of authentic detail from them. Next. Since then, we've had the benefit of basically Philip Mantle, who publishes a lot of books through Flying Disc Press. He got keen to think, well, this is a really interesting case. I wonder if Calvin's never talked about it. It's always Charlie's story. Charlie collaborated on a book earlier on, but he always wanted to know what happened to Calvin. Well, you know, is he still alive? So he puts the feelers out, and eventually he learns that Calvin had literally completely screwed up his whole life. And he just kept it, he actually changed his name so that people would know he was Calvin Parker. But it was at that time that he was starting to get on. He's married now to his sweetheart from those days. And he thought, oh, I'm going to write a book, but I want it to be my book. You know, and eventually got Philip Mantle to authorise a contract. Basically, we won't change a single word in your manuscript. It'll be warts and all. It'll be just your story. You tell it, and I'll publish it. That's what came out. And it told Calvin's story of it, but he added another dimension to it. And this is the presence of a woman, a strange woman inside this encounter. Now, if you go for the next one. These are the beings that came out and that Charlie and Calvin for a short time talked about, but Charlie was the main guy that everybody went to because Calvin just disappeared. And there's been a whole series of books. Beyond Reasonable Doubt is probably the best overall account, but beyond Pascagoula, there's quite a few other books. You know, it's almost like a cottage industry on Pascagoula happening here. But if you want to find out more immediately, next, there's a 4-part documentary series that Philip Mantle's been involved with. You can get it on the streaming service. What's the main streaming service? Anybody?
Prime?
No.
Netflix?
Netflix, I think it's on Netflix. And it's 4-part, well worth looking at. It gives you a really good thing. And I said to Philip, you know, I'm going to plug this, and you know, I've got copies of it already, and it's well worth watching. Some of it is a bit kind of overdone a bit, I think, but it's a good pathway into the story. And if after watching that, if you don't get some of the books, you're crazy, because it's a really interesting case. And I met Charlie Hickson for the briefest of face-to-face in Washington, DC in 87. And he was kind of being shunned by everybody, you know, like, I thought, wow, here's Charlie Hickson, I want to talk to him. I said, excuse me, I'm from Australia. Oh yeah, good to meet you. You know, really friendly guy, you know, and thinking, well, why aren't people talking to him? Because a lot of the other people who were, I guess, the new elite abductees, like the subject of Intruders and Whitley Strieber and a number of others, it was the first time that up to a dozen self-identified abductees that were on the stage together, but Charlie didn't really want to be there, but he was there because he felt he needed to be there. And so he was pleased to talk to some strange person from Australia for a little while. So, but you know, it was so, you know, it's the one and only MUFON conference I've been to, but they seem to get more and more commercial as the decades go on. But yeah, I would, well, if you get the chance to go to America, go to a MUFON conference. You'll certainly dive down deep for a short time anyway. But sometimes they can be a bit overwhelming, over the top. Anybody who goes to conferences where they have multi talks at the same time, it's a really irritating format. Like, yeah, I want to go to every lecture, but you can't. You know, so you've got to catch up with it on video and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, next, but check that out. The other major case, I'm finishing in a minute, is Mansfield, Ohio. Now this, from a science point of view, is amazing, this case. These are guys, reserve helicopter pilots and crew, like our reserve army type people. They'd gone to do the regular medicals that you have to do to ensure that you're fit to fly and all that kind of stuff. And so they're flying the helicopter out after the medicals and heading towards Mansfield, and they see a bright light source approaching them at high speed, and then it appears to stop in front of the helicopter, and it's literally taking up the entire canopy of the window of the helicopter. And here, at this point, Coyne, the senior guy there on the helicopter, takes hold of the controls and puts the helicopter into a dive because he's thinking, we're going to collide, you know, and he wants to get out of their airspace, and he puts it into a really, you know, he's got both hands on the controller and going into the dive. And he, at that point, there's like a beam, this green light beam is coming out of the object, and next he's aware that suddenly the helicopter, it's like hitting a bump, and then he realises the altimeter's reading a much higher altitude. Like he thought he was going into a really sharp descent, but it's all black, you know, around you, and he's thinking, oh, I've got to take note of how close the ground is. But he's been going up all this time, but he's thinking he's heading down. And he's literally forcing the joystick to go down. And yet he realised suddenly they're at this high altitude, as if this object, the green beam, has somehow dragged it up to this higher altitude. Very detailed account of the whole event. There were ground witnesses, a family, a couple of them getting out, seeing the helicopter and the UFO above it. People further down that saw the UFO, all that kind of stuff. A lot of witnesses, but according to Phil Clast and others, they were simply misperceived a meteor. That's, and I accept that as an explanation. Maybe. No, I don't. It's not. But if you want to read the actual account, read Jenny Zeidman's account from KUFOS. She was an assistant to Hynek, and she dedicated herself to investigating this case. Next, please. That's the report. You can get that freely on the KUFOS site. Just put CUFOS.org, I think it is. You'll find it anyway, fairly easily. And I've been an associate with the Centre for ages. I had the pleasure to be on a panel at the one and only MUFON conference, as I said. That's Jenny Zeidman next to me, hogging the microphone. Behind me is Jenny Randalls, and then Stanton Friedman, and Dr. Mark Rodiger, the current head who took over from Hynek when he passed away. So, next. These are details of the event, the object. Now, that's one of the most striking meteors I've ever seen. With that kind of detail, with a canopy on top and a projecting green beam, and I love it. If I was into meteor hunting, I'd love to see a meteor like that. But anyway, next. Meanwhile, back in Oz, I'm segueing back to the Northwest Cape, virtually within days. Here's this Northwest Cape, far north, Western Australia, at Exmouth, this facility, ultra low frequency signalling going on with the antenna array, and here's this sighting. The clearest sighting is from a fire captain, an Australian fire captain, who witnessed this. This is an article I wrote for Science Digest back in the day. Next. Details of the site. Next. The magazine where the article came out. The article, great artwork. And next. That's the fire captain, Bill Lynn. He describes a Saturn-shaped thing with possibly some sort of thing under the darkened area underneath. And this is sitting above the ridge line of the mountain range to the west of the facility. And then it seems to take off at some phenomenal speed. Meanwhile, unknown to him until later, the deputy commander of the base, and he's a fellow that we have had no luck finding, but the report forms we got hold of were redacted. But in Bill Lynn's report, there's the question asked, and this was entered into a standard pro forma form by Air Force Intelligence. And when you think about the sensitivity of the base, number one, the question I'd be asking, how did it end up on a standard RFF form? Why? But anyway, Bill Lynn's report, there's a reference to other witnesses, and he writes there what appears to be Bill Moyer, but it turns out to be, I think, Bill Meyer, but people like myself, Paul Dean, Keith Baskerville, and others, we've searched heaven and hell for every conceivable Meyer in the book, particularly with the US Navy and all those kind of people that were at the base, but we can't find Meyer now. Time's getting on, but fortunately the family connected with Keith, I think, and this photograph of Bill they shared with us, and so we're able to put a face to the name. Next. And the closing thing, this case, this is where I'm getting back to your Coogee case for the grand finale. QFOS put out another report by David Webb, who was the main investigator of the Betty and Barney Hill case. They called 1973 the year of the humanoids. Just alone in America, there are dozens of cases. There are examples in Australia, but 73 was kind of like a secret year. Like, if I didn't describe what was happening at Turingham and Mount Butler, nobody else would know about it. if I didn't find out about it, I don't think it would have been shared. But whatever was going on at Turingham was really intense. But here in Goffstown, New York State, there's a woman who worked as a Swedish masseur and had finished her evening shift and was heading home. Met up with a girlfriend at a cafe, had a cup of coffee just to make the journey home. Day is done, it's late at night. And she's driving down the road, she sees this light source, this object approaches, cut a long story short, here's this object, a sphere with a dome-shaped thing in the middle with an entity standing in it. And she's terrified, literally terrified. And she's, it's a really striking account. But Brian James, who was a sketch artist for the APRA organisation that I was with, he did really, like I tried to do, but he did it a lot better than I did, forensic artwork to try and do it exactly how the witness described it in the framework of the location, using the sighting data, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, she's terrified and this thing's literally above the car. She crashes into the driveway of a local place there, stumbles out of the vehicle, banging on the door, help me, help me, help me. You know, and eventually the people come out and they see what appears to be a bright light disappearing into the distance. Now, there were many more encounters like that. You know, even just some crazy cases, some really weird cases. But you need to familiarise yourself. You know, the Year of the Humanoids would be a great place to start. But what I liked about this account, talk about déjà vu. Next, Coogee, spherical object. These are fairly rare in the UFO literature, but they occur. There's like a dome thing. It's not 100% precise, but the witness, he was such a quiet, conservative person, and I don't see him here, but he seemed to be no knowledge of the UFO phenomenon, the circumstances under which I found out about it. I had to meet up with him at late night, after midnight, at McDonald's in the city. There was like a regular gathering of people that had shift work would gather, and they'd talk about all sorts of things. And he saw this going on, he joined it. So he would regularly come in once a week to do his supermarket run, living at Coogee, get the last train back to Coogee, go home, have a feed, go to bed. And but he was seemed to me shy, reserved type of guy. But I got this mainly from another source who was at that gathering, and then I wanted to meet with him, and eventually meet with him on the 29th, oh no, actually about a week after the event. And it's as you described, sees this object, he's freaked out by it, and he hides behind an electrical signal box, and then he sees the thing seem to have like a stick, and it moves the stick, and then it seems to take off at high speed. And meanwhile underground, on the ground, on the roadway, this is a major road, and it seems to have burnt it or discoloured the tar, and it's very close to telegraph poles. And when I get there and start doing the investigation after a few weeks and going on for months, trying to figure out what happened, and the burnt tree, burnt bark, that's why I love this French laboratory to do some work on the burnt bark that I've got, but they might. But I verified the burnt bitumen within a day or two that had been repaired because it's a high traffic area. Try and get some intelligent feedback out of the main roads department, the local council. Why did you repair the thing? Were any photographs taken of the damage? You know, all that kind of stuff. What do you want to know for? Well, I'm doing an investigation of something unusual. Do you want to know what caused that burnt mark? Nah, fuck off, mate. You know, all that kind of stuff, you know. It's that kind of typical response. And then again with the telegraph pole, the locals told me the telegraph pole was removed and then replaced within a week of the event. Try and find out from the electrical bureaucracy, why was the telephone pole replaced? That kind of was broken, you know, it was affected, mangled, we had to replace it. So we replaced it, you know. what do you want to know for? You know, the same deal. You know, they don't want to tell you. There's the bureaucracy just shut tight. Not for any secret reasons, I don't think, but just who cares about what are you talking about? UFOs? What? You know? No, this is a high traffic street. We've got to keep it going, you know. And it's one of the main roads that comes up from Coogee Beach. And it sure gets busy. But at night time, at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, it's dead. It finally quiets down, except on weekends. This wasn't a weekend. And so I was camping out a lot there, but at night time, took a few people down. Nothing happened, but picked up on a few people that saw strange things, but that's it. So you're satisfied with that account of Coogee? Good? Yep. There you go. You can come out with us one night if you like. Yeah. Okay. Next, end of the show. Another case exactly like it, the sphere at Coosac in 1967, being seen by 2 children in particular and possibly a couple of other villagers. We're not sure about the other witnesses, but they were seeing what they could describe them as little devils. They seemed to be dressed in black, and they would suddenly they noticed the kids looking at them, and they all started to enter the object, but they didn't enter the object in a conventional way. They would float up and go into the top of the object. And that's important in the explanation that was put forward. But one being was left on the ground. And then eventually he's flown up and gone in the same way. They almost left him behind. Often takes off. And the explanation put forward, wait for it, military helicopter. Now, if it was a bunch of commandos, the last way you want to enter a helicopter is through the top of the helicopter. You know, I'm not going to explain why, but it's kind of self-evident. You know, chop suey, that's it. Yeah. But this case became one of the favourite cases of the future founder of JPAN, the French UFO agency. He was friends with the French president at the time, Mitterrand, and managed to convince him to fund JPAN. And he was obsessed about this case, and he investigated it and could never explain it. So here we have 3 cases. There are probably other cases around. I've been looking for others, but these are the main 3 that I've come across. And it kind of added some more confidence to Coogee. You know, like I would have liked to have had more time. You know, I couldn't even find out where this guy lived. He wouldn't give me his last name. The guy that told me didn't know his last name. He's just a guy that turned up at our regular McDonald's meetings. You know, and they got a bit rowdy at times. They'd cover all sorts of topics, UFOs, mysteries, paranormal, other things, politics occasionally. Never the footy, but all that kind of stuff. But it was all about unusual things. And I attended a few of the sessions and stuff like that. But then he only showed up the once. And that was the only time, for a short time, I got to talk to him. Didn't want to be recorded. But he, you know, a really shy guy, but at least I listened to what he had to say, and the notes that my contact had given me about it were pretty accurate on what he said. But to him, it was just something that happened to him. He didn't want to share it, really, didn't want it out there. But I tried to explain to him, well, it's a pretty interesting event, you know, let's share it. But no, that's it, I think. Next, that's it. The year that definitely changed everything, as far as I'm concerned. So, 1973.